The Russian hacking in the 2016 U.S. presidential election has become the poster child for the issue of cybercrime, a growing threat in the United States, not only for the powerful, but for average citizens as well. U.S. intelligence agencies have not only unanimously blamed the Russians for the hacking of Democrats' computers, but have also concluded that the leaking of thousands of emails of top Democrats was done to help Donald Trump win. So, what can be done about what's already happened, and how can we prevent hacking by the Russians and others in the future? David Hickton was U.S. Attorney for Western Pennsylvania from 2010 to November of 2016. His office in Pittsburgh was involved in a number of major indictments involving cybercrime. He's now the head of the University of Pittsburgh's Institute for Cyber Law, Policy, and Security. Billions of people worldwide spend a good portion of their lives online, but the laws and policies for protecting them from hackers have not been able to keep up. And you've described this environment as the Wild West. Why is it like this, especially in an advanced country like the United States?
Well, our practices across the platform of digital space have expanded dramatically, perhaps best illustrated by the fact that in 1993, about 3% of two-way communications were over the internet, and 20 years later, about 3% are not. So we've taken the internet platform and made it ubiquitous in our lives. And at the same time, the technology that you can best demonstrate by how fast we go through iterations of our cell phones is moving so rapidly that the law can't possibly keep up. And so what's happening is we're applying law to digital space and trying to reassert the norms and practices we had in the pre-digital era. But the technology and the changes have changed one fundamental equation, which is the underpinning of almost all of our law involving privacy, which is what is your reasonable expectation of privacy. So in the pre-digital age, when you wrote a letter and you put it in an envelope and you sealed it and you put it in the post box for mailing, you had a clear expectation of privacy. But what is our expectation of privacy in digital space? And how does our expectation in the United States differ from the rest of the world? And these are some of the challenges we're grappling with.
It's been said that you shouldn't put anything in your emails that you don't want to end up seeing on the front page of the Washington Post. Should we just assume that nothing we do online is done in private?
I think we all recognize that the digital environment is here, and I think we recognize that we need to be able to communicate in a digital environment and still have privacy. Let me give you an example. A student talking to his or her professor about their performance in class. That's all online now. And in order to help that student, the professor may have to be brutally candid about their strengths and weaknesses. Another example would be a high school student working with his or her coach about their athletic performance, or maybe even communicating either example to the parents of the student. It would be very bad and almost tragic if those candid assessments, which are designed to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the student, and that private environment were to be distorted by just simply us being resigned to the fact that anything over a digital medium is fair game and no longer private.
So in other words, having a professor hold back useful information because of the fear that it's going to end up in somebody else's.
Exactly. And I think that we still expect that our internet communications are as private as the letter that we seal in an envelope. But the question is whether our expectation is valid. And I think that, people are struggling with this and using a range of examples to try to understand what our expectations should be. So, are you safer in a small community where there's just a small population And do you have more privacy in that community, say a rural community of 1,000 citizens? Or are you safer if you're in New York City in Manhattan in Times Square with there's just so many people that you can get lost and you can enhance your anonymity because there's a greater number of people? So in the big data environment that we're in right now, where there's just so much occurring, so much data, the speed of information exchange has been accelerated to the point where it's an avalanche of material. Your communications may be lost in this volume of data, and that may give you greater privacy protection than if you're in a smaller environment with a limited number of people. So I think people are struggling with where we're going to settle out on this. I have a very strong point of view, though. I believe that our rules of engagement, our norms and our laws in the pre-digital age have served us very well, and that people, particularly in the United States, have a strong expectation of privacy and intended two-way communications. And I argue, why should it change in digital space? We should make sure that our communications are private, and certainly my service as United States Attorney was tribute to that point of view, because you could reduce all of my work down at that time to the simple proposition that I was trying to apply law to the digital space.
I think a lot of us use computers, send emails, and disclose information online without really knowing who might be gaining access to our private information that we think is secure and that we probably want to believe is secure, because to think anything else would be to surrender all of your sleep at night.
Yeah, and I think it's an easy question when you're talking about criminals who are deliberately hacking you to harvest your information. So if you're the victim of a hack where someone is stealing your social security number or your driver's license number or your banking credentials or your passwords, it's an easy question because the laws clearly prohibit that. But I personally am of the view that our standards before the internet are still good standards. So you're a journalist, and if we commingled our papers and I were to accidentally take your notebook, I would give it back to you. I wouldn't take it and use it and read it. I'm a lawyer, and in civil discovery and legal proceedings, if you accidentally give me documents that are privileged, there's a doctrine called inadvertent disclosure. I'm obligated upon sanctions for my law license to give it back to you. I don't take it and I don't use it because it's just not permitted under the law. And in the recent cycle of the WikiLeaks discussion in the election, in my humble opinion, we had private communications that were exploited, and how they were exploited to affect our critical infrastructure, the integrity of our electoral system, is one question. But beyond that, I personally chose not to read them. And I pay tribute to Marco Rubio, who I think was a statesman during this period of time, where he said, look, it's the Democrats right now whose ox is being gored with this, but it could be us next time. And we don't want to be in a world where someone is being extorted based upon the threatened disclosure of their daughter's email communications. And so I think that it is still not only the law, but it is an accepted standard that if you accidentally or deliberately come upon someone's private communications, even if they're over the internet, you don't read them. That's how I live my life. I just don't do that. I
But
think,
unfortunately, you have so many unscrupulous people who would read them.
I think we have to reach a common understanding, and I was a little bit disappointed that there wasn't more collective outrage about this. This is a point that I think is not a partisan political issue. I think it's a point that we have a shared interest in, and that is, if we know communications were intended to be private, it doesn't matter if they're in a sealed envelope over the internet or over the internet, we should respect that privacy. And I don't think that we want to exploit candid, confidential communications of others. I just don't do that. I don't think we want to do that.
As U.S. Attorney for Western Pennsylvania, you were at the center of a number of major indictments involving, among others, Chinese hackers. What do we know about the Russian hacking, and how is this different?
The best way to answer that question would be architecturally, they're kind of opposite platforms. So when we did the hacking of American companies by the Chinese PLA, we established that it was a unit of the Chinese government, and it was my decision to ultimately to put pictures of the 5 defendants at the back of the indictment. I did that for the reason that I thought it was illustrative that we really knew who did this. But it also happened to be revealing because they were captured in their uniforms. So their hacking was their day job. They were an identified unit, Unit 61398, who worked out of a specific building in Shanghai, China that was built and paid for by the Chinese army. And their unit had the specific purpose of aggressively combing the internet to steal intellectual property. The Russian hacking platform is much different. And we did the case against Evgeny Bogachev 2 weeks after we did the China case. And in that case, it seems like the Russian hacking architecture is more a group of subcontractors who might be internet criminals who are used by the Russian government in a way to put the government in the position of saying that we're not behind that. It gives them a further defense on the attribution, taking it back to the state.
Like putting soldiers in generic uniforms in Ukraine and as a way of distancing yourself.
Right. And it's not just our discovery here in Western Pennsylvania in the Bogachev case. There's been a lot written about the Russian hacking enterprise, and Director Comey of the FBI has said one way to understand this is the Chinese hackers are very prolific and they're out in the open, whereas the Russian hackers are very skilled and they're much more cloaked in secrecy. But we weren't the first place to deal with Russian hackers. Their signature is pretty well known. And I think that contrast is the best way to demonstrate the difference.
House Intelligence Committee Chairman Devin Nunes, a Republican in California, said the Russian hacking in the 2016 election was the biggest intelligence failure since 9/11. What do you think?
I don't agree. I think the intelligence community came forth very firmly on October 7th and unanimously identified the fact that the hacking occurred and laid it at the feet of Russia. I think the bigger disappointment about what happened there is, again, there's not universal and collective outrage about it. It's being argued still to this day and being characterized in some of the debate as a partisan issue. I firmly believe this is not a partisan issue, that Republicans and Democrats, and indeed all Americans, should be concerned about the integrity of our elections. And they should also know that this was not the first time our elections were hacked. In 2008, then Senator Obama and Senator McCain were both hacked. And in 2012, candidate Romney was hacked. And some of that formed the basis for why I felt so strongly that we should make cybercrime a priority here in Western Pennsylvania, because I am of the view that if we are the world's celebrated example of democracy, that we should all be concerned about any effort to intrude into our elections. And so I don't think there was a question of whether the intelligence community investigated it and came forward and made a clear statement about it. I think the question presented today is, what are we going to do about it? And I believe we should investigate it, and we should do it correctly.
If this wasn't an intelligence failure, then what is it that the FBI and the intelligence community in the United States may have misunderstood about Putin and his intentions?
Russia, for purposes of advancing their state interest, has had a long history of active interference and investigations in Eastern Europe. They were in Georgia in 2007. They were in Kazakhstan. It appears today there's evidence that they're involved in trying to influence the election in France, that they may be involved in trying to influence the electoral process in Germany, and that maybe the Netherlands. Their signature and their frequency of doing this are pretty much established. And, you know, if you were to reduce it down to its essence, they appear to be interested in gaining adverse intelligence on the candidate who they disfavor, so-called compromat, and they generally appear to be trying to drive turnout down by making the public think that everybody's corrupt and the system is rigged. And that sounds pretty familiar to what the narrative was in our own election last fall. And, you know, their purpose appears to be to advance their national interest in elections. And one has to ask the basic question that if they're under sanctions from the United States and they have an interest in the election and they have decided to advance that interest in our election, whether in a free and open society, whether they have that right. But the question then becomes, what is our responsibility if that's going to occur? And how do we conduct ourselves? So I don't think it was a question that we did not know it was going on. It appears from what I have read that people in Washington were afraid that it would look political if any steps were taken before the election. And so decisions were made to not take any affirmative steps to stop it beyond advising Russia that we knew it was happening. After the election, President Obama levied sanctions, and I thought that was a great step. But now I think it's incumbent upon all of us to come together as a country, Democrats, Republicans, in a nonpartisan fashion, and find out exactly what did happen. Because it's one thing if Russia advances its state interest because they don't like the sanctions that are imposed upon them and they think one candidate may favor them. It's another thing if people participating on our side of the ocean in the election were complicit in that process. And so I think we all would be served by finding out what exactly happened, and I'm hopeful that a process will be put in place which will allow us to investigate it with seriousness and with purpose and with urgency, and that we will do it correctly.
You have been critical of Mr. Trump for downplaying the Russians' involvement in this hacking incident. What should he have said?
Well, I think he should be on the side of let's find out what happened and let's investigate it urgently and properly. And where I have been critical is in the suggestion that this is not a big deal. I've been critical in the suggestion that we should just move on from this. And I've been critical in the suggestion, and this is where I've been most critical, where I've said that it is not helpful for the commander-in-chief to discredit one of his greatest assets, which is our intelligence community. And when the intelligence community, in a unanimous way, all 17 intelligence agencies say that we know that Russia did this, I fail to understand how it helps any of our national interests for the president to attack the intelligence community and say they don't know what they're talking about.
In the meantime, how do we stop the Russians from hacking into our computers?
the same question that's been presented with regard to all hacking challenges, whether they're state-sponsored or individuals. And the simple answer is you have to put cost into the equation for the hacker. So the great watershed event of indicting China is a good example. That case was a huge sea change for the U.S. government. It was the first time we had used the tool of criminal indictment to challenge what was known nation-state hacking that had been occurring for approximately a decade. You know, the companies that were the victims there and who've been the victims of other hacking for years were spending tremendous sums on research and development to innovate, to create new processes and products, and then they were finding copycat products off their own innovation and invention in the marketplace being sold by state-sponsored competitors for below cost. We are still the cradle of the world's research and development, education, and innovation. That is our edge in a world economy, and we cannot let it be taken from us. And so we brought the case against China in May of 2014, and in September 2015, something really dramatic occurred. President Xi met with President Obama, and he said, we will not hack to steal intellectual property. That hacking for stealing intellectual property is stealing. We will not do it. And we reached an agreement with China that everybody agrees came from that case. And it is acknowledged, as it was at the time that I and Eric Holder announced the case, that espionage for national security reasons was entirely proper, but espionage state-sponsored against American private companies to give an advantage to state-owned companies in China was stealing. And that epiphany occurred to China because we put cost in the equation for them by bringing the case here in Pittsburgh. The same thing happens with simple hackers who might be, you know, 4 individuals in Eastern Europe working off a laptop, or they might be an organized confederacy like the Dark Code group that we also did here in Pittsburgh. When you bring the case, you establish attribution, you put a criminal sanction in front of them, you declare that you know how they're doing it, and in Dark Code and in the Game Over Zeus, which was the foundation of the Bogachev case, and in the Avalanche case that was announced just a couple days after I left office, we used civil process to seize the domain and take down the criminal architecture. That's putting cost in the equation. So we need to put cost in the equation for Russia. The president and this administration need to make it clear to Russia that hacking here in the United States, whether it's state-sponsored to interfere in our elections, whether it's state-sponsored or individual confederacies of criminals to steal our assets, that we're not going to stand for it. We're going to make a stand on it. To let it go on, or to say it doesn't matter, or to let it give them a pass by saying we need to get over this, is precisely the wrong policy in my view.
What role can the new Institute for Cyber Law, Policy, and Security that you're heading up at the University of Pittsburgh play in all of this?
Well, I'm really excited about this opportunity. There are so many questions that we don't have answers to. I'll give you a couple. We still have to figure out the balance between security and privacy. It played out in the encryption debate last year, but generally everybody knows we need a place to have a quiet adult conversation about where is that balance. Because everybody understands privacy is important, but the United States has the toughest privacy laws for law enforcement, and I think most people accept that we cannot create an out-of-bounds access point for criminals that government and the law enforcement with valid probable cause cannot access. But we also understand that if that's possible, if the government can access it, then it's really not private. So we need that conversation. We're on the verge of a new frontier in precision medicine. The pill that you take is not the pill that I should take. We don't need generic treatment for specific patient problems. The evolution of big data and all the opportunities big data are going to provide to us are going to put us in a position that we could stop for a moment talking about cybersecurity threats and start talking about big data opportunities. But in the precision medicine area, this is rich and hugely exciting. So you might go to your doctor and instead of having to fill out a clipboard with a pencil, which we do now in a digital age, to report your history since the last visit, your data, protected, could be online, and the doctor could look at all of your various tests, and it might signal electronically or digitally to the doctor that you have an aberrant result over here, and then it might give the doctor all the literature that the doctor would need in a keystroke.
On an iPad or something.
On an iPad, so that you can have a much more fruitful, much more efficient visit. We just had a near collapse of the Liberty Bridge here. In the past, we hire in a linear fashion an engineer who by the hour is going to study how to fix that, and we hope it was fixed correctly. But we have a lot of bridge problems here. We have an infrastructure challenge. We have a lot of bridges falling down. It might be nice if we could get ahead of those problems before we have what happened in Minnesota several years ago where a bridge falls down.
It's a nationwide problem.
Yeah, so I resist the discussion when people talk about the Cybersecurity Institute at Pitt. Cybersecurity has become a term of art like Kleenex to describe all things cyber, and it means different things to different people. Cybersecurity, in a narrow sense, means stopping intrusions from your data, protecting your data from unwanted intrusions. And as U.S. Attorney, that was a large part of my work. My work today is much broader than that. It's more about how do we establish rules and protections and opportunities and safeguards now that we've connected 7 billion people around the world to this digital platform, which has accelerated so fast, where the technology has improved so quickly that we don't have any rules of engagement for it. This was originally a humble endeavor to create an internet for purposes of allowing researchers in the university to communicate, and it was established by the US government through DARPA. And we never intended, I don't think, that we would become so interconnected that we'd have all of our critical infrastructure attached to it and completely exposed. And now the whole discussion of Internet of Things, you know, your household appliances are going to be digital, your home protection system you can look at on a laptop, your car. We're about to enter the world. We're at the vanguard of change on the subject of driverless vehicles. The Uber experiment is here and in Shanghai. What is the risk to us if people with an ill heart and digital proficiency could take over a car that's running over the internet? Just imagine that. We better get ahead of that before it happens.
David Hickton was U.S. Attorney for Western Pennsylvania from 2010 to November of 2016. He's now the head of the University of Pittsburgh's Institute for Cyber Law, Policy, and Security. David Hickton, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.